Walt Whitman es tal vez uno de los verdaderos padres profundos de Estados Unidos. Un poeta fundante, como Emerson y como tantos otros. Y hay un poema de Walt Whitman que trae un sonido, una energía y tal vez una pista para entender el corazón profundo de Estados Unidos. Y el poema se llama Oigo cantar a América. Yo escucho a América cantar. Canciones muy variadas yo escucho. Las de los mecánicos alegres y fuertes. La del carpintero que entona la suya mientras mide las tablas y las vigas. La del albañil que canta la suya aprestándose a trabajar o a dejar ya el trabajo. La del botero que canta a cuánto le pertenece en el bote y la del estibador que canta en la cubierta del vapor. La del zapatero que canta al sentarse ante su banco y la del sombrerero que entona de pie la suya. La canción del leñador y la del labrador que se encamina al trabajo por la mañana para dejarlo al mediodía o a la puesta de sol. La deliciosa canción de la madre, la canción de la joven en el trabajo y de la joven que cose o que lava. Cada uno de ellos canta lo que a él o a ella le pertenece. Nada más. El día lo que al día le pertenece. Por la noche, la fiesta de los jóvenes compañeros, robustos, amistosos, canta a plena voz sus fuertes y melodiosos cantos. 1867, Walt Whitman. Para tratar de entender ¿qué es Estados Unidos de Norteamérica? ¿Cuál es su esencia? ¿Cuál es su relación con los otros países, con el mundo, con el orden internacional actual, con lo que somos, con lo que hemos sido? Tenemos el privilegio de contar en esta conversación, en una belleza nueva, con Francis Fukuyama. Muchas gracias, Fukuyama, de estar aquí en Chile y en esta conversación. Lo primero que quería preguntarle, ¿cuál es la canción que ha cantado siempre América, para usar esta expresión metafórica del poeta Walt Whitman? ¿Cuál es la canción más profunda que ha cantado siempre América?
Well, there are many national songs. I guess the one that begins earliest on is probably America the Beautiful, which simply speaks about the physical expanse, and I think the physical characteristic of America also is a symbol for its social and political prospects also, because it's a wide open country where people can make whatever they want of their lives and make their lives beautiful, as is the country itself. So I would say that in many respects that's the most important song.
Ahora, la pregunta que uno se hace es, escuchando la voz del poeta, ¿qué canción escucha hoy día el mundo de Estados Unidos? Si acaso la canción o la palabra que América lleva al mundo es la misma que se escuchaba antes. ¿Qué ha pasado con la canción que Estados Unidos le canta al mundo? A nosotros, Sudamérica, Asia, África, Irak, etc.
Well, I think that one of the things that happened since the end of the Cold War is that the United States emerged as the single most powerful country in the world by far. The United States spends more on its military today than all of the rest of the world combined, virtually. And there's a big disproportion in the political power, the economic power, the cultural power of the United States. And I think that Americans like to think of themselves as kind of innocent, that they have built a democracy for themselves that should be a model for the rest of the world that other people can look up to. But they now are thrust in this position of having this power over the rest of the world for good or evil. And I think that it's both an opportunity and a temptation. Obviously, it's an opportunity to use your power to support democracy and freedom, but it's also a temptation to use that power to restructure the world in ways that, suit American interests, but not necessarily those of other countries. And so I think part of the problem we're facing now is that some of that innocence, that happened when the United States was a young, isolated country has, it's been a long time since we've lost that innocence, but particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because there's nobody to physically oppose us, I think it's put a bigger burden of responsibility on the United States.
Esa inocencia de la que usted habla, señor Fukuyama, de alguna manera muestra que a veces Estados Unidos tiene esa maravillosa capacidad de acoger, de haber acogido pueblos distintos, etnias distintas, lenguas distintas, ¿no? Y coexistir pacíficamente en una democracia que ha funcionado. Pero al mismo tiempo da la impresión a veces, usted me tendrá que decir o corregir, que también hay una suerte de ceguera, una incapacidad de Estados Unidos, o una parte de Estados Unidos, o de su élite dirigente, de ver el mundo, verlo, digamos, desde una mirada distinta, desde la mirada del otro. ¿Es así?
I think that's clearly the case. The United States is a world in itself. It's very diverse, it's very big. Most Americans can go through their entire lives without having to worry about neighbors, people from outside the United States. And I think that it's led to a kind of solipsism where we measure the world by our own standards, but it does become difficult, I think, for Americans to put themselves in the position, and particularly to put themselves in the position of somebody weak in trying to deal with the United States. That's a very unfamiliar problem, I think, for many Americans. So I think you're right about that.
Señor Fukuyama, usted ha dicho que América, o Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, está hoy día en una encrucijada. Ese es el título de su libro, América en la encrucijada. ¿Cuál es esa encrucijada en la que se encuentra Estados Unidos hoy día?
Well, I think that it, in the first place, has to do with foreign policy. As I said, we have this big margin of power, and I think that the Bush administration, after September 11th, first of all, the country felt very threatened and fearful, and felt that it needed to defend itself, but it also embarked on this very ambitious and, in a way, expansionist program of trying to use that power for the purpose of what was described by one neoconservative as benevolent hegemony. We'd fix the problems of human rights, of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism around the world as they occurred, but in a way that was not regarded as legitimate by very many people around the world, including many of America's closest democratic allies in Europe and countries in Latin America that were democratic and I think otherwise sympathetic, because I think people simply did not trust America to exercise that power responsibly. I'm sorry to say that because of the, I think, really incompetent way that the whole Iraq war was handled, it didn't increase the confidence that people around the world had in America's ability to order the world, especially to the benefit of other people. I think also with all of the Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, prisoner abuse scandals, a lot of the moral prestige that the United States enjoyed, particularly after the Cold War, has been very much undermined. And so the crossroad, I think, is the question of how the United States relates to the rest of the world from this point forward. Do we do it primarily through our power, or do we do it through the example that we set, through the moral capital of the idea that the United States represents, and less through this direct use of power? My own personal view is it's very important to demilitarize our foreign policy and to try to restore some of that moral standing that I think we once enjoyed.
Usted habla de esta posición moral de Estados Unidos. También, de alguna manera, eso está en el discurso de la administración Bush cuando se han hecho invasiones. Hay un discurso moral o hay un discurso ético detrás. Se dice que hay que vencer al eje del mal, por ejemplo. Incluso un lenguaje con un cierto resabio, o no decirlo directamente, religioso. Cuando Estados Unidos a sí mismo se ha visto como ese pueblo luminoso sobre la colina, esa expresión que usaba o citaba Ronald Reagan, ¿hay detrás de todo eso la sensación de que Estados Unidos se cree a sí mismo como un pueblo elegido, un poco como lo fue el pueblo de Israel en el Antiguo Testamento? ¿Qué hay de verdad en eso?
Well, I have with me still some American currency, an American dollar bill, okay? And on the back of the dollar bill, there's a symbol of a pyramid, the Great Pyramid with an eye, all-seeing eye at the top. It's a Masonic symbol. George Washington was a Freemason. And underneath that pyramid, it has the Latin inscription, Novus Ordo Seclorum, which means New Order of the Ages. And this was something, that symbol was devised in the late 1700s, 18th century. And I think right from the beginning of the American Republic, Americans had a self-conception that they were setting up a new experiment in democracy that would not be involved in the power politics of old Europe, that it would be a model for other countries to follow. And actually, for the first, I would say, 150 years of America's existence. Now, I know it's hard in Latin America to convince people that this is true, but a lot of Americans actually believe that you could only maintain that virtue by remaining relatively isolated from the rest of the world. So I think George Bush is not making something up. Woodrow Wilson was the other great American president that was very much associated with this idea that the U.S. represented a political idea, a universal political idea, and therefore had a special role to play in bringing democracy to other parts of the world.
Quiero hacer una pregunta más personal en relación a su visión crítica sobre el rol, por ejemplo, de algunos grupos ideológicos que fueron los que impulsaron de alguna manera la última invasión de Irak, la idea de la guerra preventiva, etcétera, que ha cambiado radicalmente el escenario. ¿Usted de pronto descubrió esto, tuvo una visión, tuvo una crisis? ¿Qué significó para usted? Usted a uno lo asociaba a un grupo ideológico conservador, formaba parte de alguna manera o cercano al grupo ideológico de los neoconservadores. ¿Cuándo de pronto usted tiene ese cambio, ese viraje? ¿Qué le pasó a usted interiormente?
Well, it's something that happened between September 11th and the outbreak of the Iraq War, because I started to listen very carefully to the arguments that were being made in favor of the war, both by some of my friends, these so-called neoconservatives, and also by the President and by the Bush administration. And I found on so many different counts that the argument wasn't persuasive, that particularly the argument that we would be able to transform the Middle East in a democratic image, which seemed to me to actually go against much of the accumulated wisdom of other neoconservatives who in previous generations had argued precisely against that kind of almost Leninist ambition to use political power to bring about social justice or democracy or anything else. And I guess I also had the feeling, well, it was several things. I think they believed that democracy was an easy thing to achieve in Iraq and the Middle East. And everything I have learned about democracy in my life tells me that it's actually a very difficult thing to achieve. And I guess also just traveling around the world and talking to non-Americans, it seemed to me quite evident that this was just not something regarded as particularly legitimate by the rest of the world, and that we needed to worry about the legitimacy of what the United States did.
Bueno, yo me imagino que tiene que haber sido difícil para usted discutirle a sus propios amigos y mantener un punto de vista crítico, sobre todo en un ambiente de patriotismo, de un discurso nacionalista exacerbado en relación al conflicto. ¿Qué le sucedió a usted, digamos? ¿Se sintió aislado, se sintió solo? ¿Qué le pasó a usted en ese contexto del cambio de visión que tuvo frente al escenario de la guerra de Irak?
Well, that's one nice thing about being a tenured professor and achieving a certain status is you don't have to worry about people not liking you because they can't do anything to you. But also, well, it's two things. First of all, I think a lot of my friends actually also have doubts themselves, and so it wasn't that I was making a complete break and saying things that they would never, think. That was true of some, but not of others. But the other thing is that America is very divided right now. I've never seen the country as polarized in, a camp of Bush supporters and Bush haters. And I think the hatred for Bush is among, at least 50% of the American public is as much as I've seen for any American president in recent years. So for every friend I lost, I gained a new friend in some respects.
Ahora, la pregunta es la siguiente. Uno se hace la siguiente, con la experiencia de Estados Unidos, con su tradición diplomática, con la experticia. Estados Unidos es un país del rigor donde las cosas se hacen bien, es una de las características exportables de una cultura tradicional norteamericana. ¿Cómo se pudieron haber equivocado tanto los asesores al analizar los escenarios post-invasión de Irak? ¿Cómo hubo un error tan garrafal?
Well, it was a combination of things. I believe that the basic mistake was a result of a misreading of the way that the Cold War ended. The Cold War ended in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, with scarcely a shot being fired anywhere in Eastern Europe. I think most people at that time were completely surprised by that. They expected there to be resistance and hardliners and violent struggle, and instead this totalitarian system that we had feared simply blew away within 7 or 8 months. And I think that many people who were in the Bush administration were also in government at that time, in the first Bush administration, George Bush's father's administration. And I think that they derived the wrong lesson from that this is the way that totalitarian regimes collapse. But I also think that there's just a certain amount of arrogance in the way they approach things, because they really did have the feeling that they were right and did not have to listen to expertise in other parts of the American government and from people who had been, in the Middle East and this sort of thing. And so I think that's one of the dangers, in a way, of being a little bit too powerful.
Llama la atención porque la base filosófica sobre la que se funda Estados Unidos tiene que ver muchas veces con una tradición del empirismo, de la conexión con la realidad, de observar la realidad y obtener eficientemente resultados de ella. Cualquier ser humano fuera de Estados Unidos, cualquiera de nosotros que mirara la televisión, yo sabía sin ser experto, esto va derecho al fracaso, a la derrota, al horror. Y sin embargo, al mismo tiempo se veía este discurso optimista. O sea, hay un abismo ahí que me llamó mucho la atención en esa invasión. Si es que hubiese resultado la invasión, si no hubiese habido esta resistencia, esta insurgencia que se ha desatado ahora, esta guerra de guerrillas en Irak, ¿usted hubiese estado de acuerdo de todas maneras con la invasión por Estados Unidos de Irak?
Well, I think actually the calculation on the part of the Bush administration was that they would find weapons of mass destruction, that they would find connections with terrorism, and that democracy would come to Iraq fairly quickly. And that therefore everybody after the fact would say, well, of course we disagreed with the original decision, but now we see you're right, and they would legitimate it after the fact. Now, I still think that even if that had happened, that they took an unwarranted risk, because I think you could have told before the invasion that that was a possible outcome, but it was also probably one that was not very likely. And so the mistake was not to ever think that you might do this and get away with it. The mistake, I think, was really wrongly calculating the odds, and I think that that's the kind of risk that in the future we should not take. I think the problem is the general doctrine of preventive war, that the idea that we can solve problems that are several years into the future by preemptively acting, with military power. I think that works in a very small number of cases, but it's also a very dangerous general policy for a country to have. So even if it had worked in this case, I think it wouldn't have been a good general policy.
Algo que puede chocar también desde afuera a la lógica es esta idea de que se puede exportar la democracia a todas partes del mundo o incluso imponerla de manera totalitaria. ¿Es legítimo imponer la democracia de manera violenta o a través de una invasión a otros países donde a lo mejor no hay una preparación ni una historia y a lo mejor la valoración de la democracia es distinta que la que se da, por ejemplo, en el mundo europeo, occidental o norteamericano, etcétera? ¿Cómo se resuelve eso? ¿Se puede exportar y imponer la democracia a países que no lo tienen en su cultura, en sus genes, por decirlo así?
Well, I think just by definition you cannot impose democracy on a society that doesn't want to be democratic. The demand has to be there. So the question was there a reason for presuming that the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein would have wanted some form of democracy? And I think actually we've seen that many of them do. They voted in very large numbers in the various elections that have been held and so forth. The question, though, is I'm not sure that many of them want a liberal democracy. That is to say, a democracy that observes a rule of law, that protects the rights of religious minorities, that protects individual rights or women's rights, that is reasonably secular. That's the area where I think there is some real disagreement. And I think the lesson is, by and large, that military power is good for getting rid of dictators and tyrants, but it's really not good for positively creating democratic institutions. I think that's something that has to be done by every people in every society and not by outsiders.
¿Qué hacer ahora? ¿Cómo sale ahora Estados Unidos de esta trampa mortal en la que ha caído y en la que ha arrastrado a todo el mundo occidental? ¿Qué va a ocurrir ahora? ¿Qué haría usted si tuviera que usted aconsejar al presidente Bush, si usted fuera su asesor más directo, si recuperara su confianza? ¿Ah?
Well, I don't think he'd ask me, but if he did, I actually don't think that it would help to withdraw American forces too soon. But I do think that at a certain point we are probably going to have to draw down within the next 2 or 3 years and hope that there's enough of a political structure there that will survive once the United States leaves. I also think that in terms of America's general moral standing, we also need to have some accountability for things like the prisoner abuse. So I think we need to close the Guantanamo, prison, and we need to actually punish some of the people, the higher-up people that were responsible for putting that policy into place. That's not going to restore things to the way they were before the war, but I think those are at least beginning points.
En este libro y en otro libro, La construcción del Estado, un libro anterior que de alguna manera prepara ya la encrucijada de América, usted hace una reflexión muy interesante sobre la mirada distinta que ha tenido Europa y Estados Unidos sobre, a partir de la invasión de Irak, de cómo enfrentar el escenario posguerra fría, y que tiene que ver con la concepción del Estado de Europa y la concepción del Estado de Estados Unidos. Primero me gustaría que viéramos brevemente, hiciéramos la comparación, cómo ve un norteamericano o Estados Unidos el Estado y cómo lo ve el europeo, y cómo es posible llegar a superar ese abismo, porque son dos visiones filosóficas muy distintas.
Well, I think there's a very clear difference. After 1945, the Europeans collectively decided that the source of all of the violence in the 20th century was due to the sovereign nation state. And I think they were actually thinking more of the First World War than the Second, where the insistence on national interest and nationalism led to a war that destroyed an entire generation of Europeans and really knocked European civilization off of its pinnacle that it had achieved. And so the European Union is a deliberate project to transcend patriotism, nationalism, and to replace it with a supranational structure that will keep the peace in that part of the world. And I must say they have been very successful at it. I was there actually in Rome on the day that they signed the accession of the new members from Eastern Europe. And at the table with me was 2 Germans who had both served in the German army in World War II, and a Pole and a Hungarian. And all of them were now in this common structure, political structure. So in some sense, what Europe has been about is a kind of anti-nationalism. I think that the United States is actually more similar to most other countries in the world, where national sovereignty still means a great deal, or at least when Americans think about what is the source of legitimate political action, it is a democratic, constitutional nation state that can make decisions. And Americans have a great deal of suspicion about unelected supranational bodies that will take away some of that sovereignty. And so I think it simply reflects the very different experiences that Europeans and Americans have had.
De alguna manera hay una suerte como reacción instintiva o rechazo instintivo de Estados Unidos, de lo más profundo de su ser, ante cualquier forma supraestatal, cualquier construcción estatal por sobre otro Estado. Es un rechazo casi que viene desde adentro, del fondo del ser norteamericano. Quisiera preguntarle, señor Fukuyama, en esta idea de exportar la democracia, o tal vez defender los derechos humanos, por ejemplo, en el mundo. Ese es un argumento que se suponía válido, legitimado incluso mundialmente. La pregunta que uno se hace, ¿por qué se invade un Estado débil, como resultó ser el Estado iraquí? Un Estado que iba derechamente a perder la guerra o la invasión o el combate con Estados Unidos. ¿Y por qué no se invade China, donde se han violado los derechos humanos de manera flagrante? ¿O por qué no se invade Arabia Saudita, aliado natural de Estados Unidos, que no tiene mucho de qué enorgullecerse en términos de derechos humanos? A ver, ahí esas contradicciones, digamos, tan flagrantes, hacen que la credibilidad de Estados Unidos para el resto del mundo, para los ciudadanos normales, imaginemos para un palestino o incluso para un sudamericano, esté un poco minada esa credibilidad.
Well, of course, the United States didn't invade Iraq to democratize it. We invaded because we thought they had weapons of mass destruction and connections to terrorism, so it was a security-related issue. Obviously, you don't use this kind of power when you go up against a country that you think is really powerful. And in the Cold War, with with two great superpowers, it really did limit America's freedom of action in that respect. I know that America, whenever it espouses these general ideals of democracy and human rights, inevitably is accused of hypocrisy, because the United States can never in its foreign policy simply support human rights. It also has interests in oil, in trade, in security, in a lot of other things. It would be impossible to imagine that things could be otherwise. And so I think this has constantly been a charge against the United States, that we espouse these ideals, but we enforce them very selectively. I think that's true, but on the other hand, I guess the question I would have is, well, does that mean you would rather have the United States follow a very cynical foreign policy that said, all we're going to care about is oil, trade, national interest. We're not going to try to support, Democrats anywhere around the world. If something terrible happens in Bosnia or Kosovo or Rwanda, we're going to say we don't care, even though we're a great superpower with lots of resources and the ability to help other people. We're just going to stay out of this. And I don't think, people around the world would like that either. And in fact, if you think about it, the Europeans, when they tried to deal with the Balkans in the 1990s, couldn't do it because they couldn't agree among themselves on what to do. They didn't have the military resources, and it really did require the United States entering those conflicts in order to settle them. So I do think that American power, is used for good purposes. But the trouble is it's not always, and this charge of hypocrisy, I think, is always going to be there.
Por otro lado, también Europa de alguna manera ha sido cómoda, ha tomado una postura cómoda y a veces fácil. Queda como la que defiende los derechos humanos, la que no está por la invasión, pero al mismo tiempo demuestra su ineptitud cuando vienen conflictos tan difíciles como los Balcanes, la incapacidad para resolver, y ahí Estados Unidos que tiene que asumir el liderazgo. ¿Cuál es su visión de Europa en este sentido?
I think that Europe, because of this consensus that military power and sovereignty are things of the past, has put itself in a position where it's kind of the opposite of the United States, that it has a lot of moral credibility, but it doesn't really have the means to act on those objectives, except in in Eastern Europe and states that want to join the European Union. I think they have a lot of influence, but it's kind of the mirror image of the United States, which has tarnished its own credibility, but it's tarnished it because it actually has the power to go ahead and do things. And I think world order cannot be built on exclusively power or legitimacy. I think it really needs to be some combination of the two. And I think the Balkans was a good case of that, where actually Europe and the United States ended up, it was too late, it should have happened earlier, but I do think that it was that combination of power and legitimacy that was
Quizás
important.
esta postura de Europa se deba justamente a que Europa viene de la destrucción entre Estados, viene de una experiencia de guerra directa en su tierra que no tuvo Estados Unidos, las dos guerras mundiales, que lo hace temer de que si el poder se desata o el poder militar se desata va a volver a caer en esa vorágine o en ese abismo que prácticamente la arrasó.
That's absolutely right. The United States has a generally positive experience with the use of military power, beginning with the revolution against the British monarchy. The Civil War killed 600,000 Americans, but it ended slavery. Americans regard the World War II as a liberation of Europe, the Cold War as a liberation of Eastern Europe. And so you're right, Europeans think that war leads to disaster, and Americans think, well, you know, on occasion it's had good effects.
Quiero hacer una pregunta que se hace cualquier ciudadano normal que hoy día toma un avión y decide viajar a Estados Unidos. La sensación que uno tenía antes era de entrar a un país donde hay mucha libertad de movimiento, es una característica potente de Estados Unidos, la libertad de movimiento, de desplazamiento, esa energía que despliega ese país. Sin embargo, hoy día uno tiene la sensación de que está entrando a un estado acorralado, atrapado en el miedo y en la paranoia. ¿Qué va a pasar con eso? Es decir, el hecho de que un país como Estados Unidos, cuya esencia es la libertad de movimiento, de desplazamiento, de flujo de capitales, de personas, de ideas, esté hoy día atrapada y acorralada por el miedo. ¿No va de alguna manera a frenar su energía, su vitalidad y va a llevarla tal vez a una decadencia futura?
Well, I think you're right that the United States overreacted to September 11th. You know, this was the first time that this big a violent event had taken place on American soil, and I think Americans were very good at scaring themselves silly about, you know, possible scenarios for future terrorism, which I think has led to this condition. I know this myself because I teach in an international affairs school. We usually get 30–40% of our students being non-Americans, and you know, it's very hard for them to get into the United States, to get visas and so forth. So it's a bad situation. But you know, the American future is really up for grabs. I think there's a certain part of America that's quite afraid, but there's another part of America that's still extremely open to the world. Certainly we have so many interests that dictate continued openness. And so I don't think that the story is ended on where we're going to end up on this finally.
También me queda la sensación, una sensación contradictoria en la lectura de sus dos libros, tanto La construcción del Estado como La encrucijada de América. Por un lado, usted plantea que es necesario fortalecer estados que son débiles, estados de donde viene el terrorismo, la corrupción, la mafia, donde vienen los conflictos, ¿no?, más potentes hoy día. Pero por otro lado uno tiene la sensación de que el Estado se está poco a poco desintegrando en el mundo, o sea que hoy día vivimos en un mundo radicalmente distinto, donde hay más movimiento por debajo, lo que pasa por debajo del Estado, bueno, a través de Internet, por ejemplo, que hace que tal vez la noción de Estado que teníamos de ahora hoy día sea una noción un poco caduca. ¿Qué pasa con el Estado hoy? ¿Qué va a pasar en el futuro de nuestra civilización?
Well, during the 1990s, during the big Internet boom, it was very popular to say that the state was obsolete and it was going to be undermined by information and by the Internet and by globalization. I think that in the end that's nonsense, because the state retains one important function which no other organization can provide. It can legitimately enforce laws within a certain, you know, territory. Bill Gates can't do that, you know, the Internet can't do that. So you need states to do this. And if you look at Africa and you see these countries that cannot enforce anything and they're in a chaos of private militias, you see what the importance of having a real state is. And so the state is not going to go away, but the state has a much more difficult task, because in fact technology has made it much easier for all sorts of things, good and bad, to cross borders. In a good form it's trade, in a bad form it's drugs and laundered money and blood diamonds and things of that sort. But I think we shouldn't get carried away in this notion that the state is now obsolete and performs no function. It needs to be protected, because it still does play a very important role.
Usted al comienzo del programa sacó $1 de su bolsillo y yo quiero sacar ahora, vamos a ver si lo encuentro, un objeto tan popular en el mundo como el dólar y que también viene de Estados Unidos, un remedio que se llama Prozac, más conocida también como fluoxetina, remedio famoso contra la angustia y contra la depresión. Y quiero justamente referirme a un libro apasionante, por lo menos a mí me apasionó mucho, me pareció muy interesante, muy estimulante intelectualmente, que es El fin del hombre, consecuencias de la revolución biotecnológica. Partamos de este remedio del Prozac. Este remedio trajo la esperanza a millones de seres humanos de recuperar la autoestima, de ser felices en el mundo. Y en el futuro vamos a tener remedios más potentes que el Prozac, producidos en los laboratorios, y que nos van a llevar, parece ser, a un mundo donde la utopía va a ser la felicidad total. Y usted tiene un cierto escepticismo o una cierta reticencia a que se consume esa utopía del mundo feliz del que hablaba Aldous Huxley. Me gustaría que me explicara esa postura, esa visión suya.
Well, actually, in Brave New World, there was this drug called Soma, which you could take if you felt unhappy, and it would simply make you happy. And you know, Prozac is a very interesting drug because it works on self-esteem. There's a class of people that are severely depressed where I think it is perfectly legitimate for them to take, you know, this kind of medication. But Prozac has been shown to improve the self-esteem of virtually everybody. And I think that that's very problematic because it, in a way, undermines our moral understanding of what happiness really ought to consist of. So that I think traditionally, I could say I feel self-esteem because I have done something that should be esteemed. I've learned to play a Beethoven sonata, or I painted a picture, or I won a contest, or I won a football game. But in a sense, you take Prozac and you feel the self-esteem whether you've done anything, you know, worthy of esteem or not. And I think that's really the problem with it, is that it creates a world in which the traditional moral categories by which we've operated can be replaced by a technology in a certain sense. And that's what I think is wrong with it.
¿Cuáles son los peligros más visibles para usted de este futuro en que el mundo haya sido dominado por la técnica? Usted, de hecho, esta es una reflexión muy heideggeriana, usted parte con una cita de Heidegger, en donde dice que el gran peligro que se vislumbra en el futuro, más que la proliferación de máquinas, es que el hombre olvide o pierda el contacto con la pregunta originaria por su ser, se aleje de esa pregunta originaria. Pero usted va enumerando una serie de problemas muy prácticos que podrían ocurrir en el ámbito de la revolución genética, en la prolongación de la vejez. ¿Cuáles son, cree usted, los ámbitos más difíciles y que pueden tener efectos políticos en el mundo a partir de esta revolución biotecnológica? Voy a guardar el remedio, pero no vaya a creer que estamos haciendo publicidad de él.
Okay.
O no nos va a caer una querella.
I think that the thing that worries me the most about biotechnology is that it will give some people the ability to control the behavior of other people. So already today in the United States, a lot of children are given this drug Ritalin to control hyperactivity. But sometimes that's a pathological condition, but other times it's just boys being, you know, normal boys. But it's inconvenient for the parents and teachers to deal with them, so you give them a drug instead of trying to teach them or educate them. I think that there are other more profound ways, if we can actually increase intelligence or other genetic characteristics, we alter the very meaning, I think, of what it is to be a human being, because we are now beginning to alter human nature. Supposing that you had a genetic remedy for any proclivity to homosexuality, would that be a good thing? I mean, there are some people in the world that think it would be, but I think if you think about that, it's very troubling that you have this kind of power. Finally, the revolution that we're already in the middle of is simply the longevity revolution. Europe particularly is facing a future in which in another couple of generations, half the population will be older than 65. And we've never lived in such a society before. And I think we have to question, you know, what is the purpose of life? Is it simply, you know, to double, you know, whatever we have, or is it the quality of life that is of importance to us?
Y ahí lo importante es la concepción del hombre que tengamos, sí, del ser humano. Y usted plantea algo que es una idea políticamente incorrecta hoy, que no está de moda, que es, de alguna manera, fundar los derechos en la naturaleza humana. Volver a fundarlos en la naturaleza humana. Eso es como pasar por encima de Kant, pasar por encima de todo el empirismo anglosajón, etcétera, de toda la filosofía que se ha hecho desde el siglo XVIII en adelante. ¿Qué significa esto de volver a fundar los derechos de los seres humanos en la naturaleza del hombre? Y no fundarla con visiones utilitaristas, digamos.
Well, this was, of course, the understanding of basic rights that was in the American Declaration of Independence, but you're right that a great deal of philosophy after 1776 has denied that you can do this. But I guess the basic idea is, isn't it the case that when you strip away all of the social identities that human beings have as a Chilean, an American, male, female, black, white, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, that there's a certain core essence of being a human being that is given to us simply because we are, you know, the biological creatures that we are. We have certain faculties, language, reason, the ability to communicate, to socialize, to reproduce in a particularly human way, and that when we talk about the universality of human rights, it is because we believe that simply the fact that you're Chinese and you're being put in jail doesn't make you less unhappy with that injustice than if you're Chilean or an American. So I think that, you know, there is I think that human nature, even if we don't admit it to ourselves, the idea that there's a universal human nature is quite important for our understanding of where rights come from.
¿De qué mundo estamos más cerca hoy día? ¿Quién, digamos, tuvo una visión más certera de la literatura? ¿Aldous Huxley en El Mundo Feliz o George Orwell en 1984? ¿Quién de los dos, le diríamos en chileno, le achuntó más?
George Orwell, in a sense, was very accurate in his technological prediction. If you remember, he envisioned this thing he called a telescreen, which was basically a big flat panel monitor, and people could communicate through it, and Big Brother could look at you and you could look out, and that's really arrived. It's just called the Internet. You know, it's called a computer hooked up to the Internet. But where he was wrong, I think, was in his political interpretation of what that would mean, because he believed that that would be a technological means of reinforcing central power that would be able to control people, whereas in fact I think it's diffused power. It's given power to ordinary people in a very remarkable way. So in a way he was very wrong, and he was also very right at the same time. Huxley will have to see. I think technologically, again, he was very prescient about what would happen, whether the dehumanization that he predicted will actually occur. I think we still have to wait and see.
¿Tenemos que esperar o ya estamos entrando en una especie de era posthumana? Usted llama que estamos a las puertas de entrar en un mundo posthumano. ¿O estamos ya instalados dentro de lo que Heidegger llamó el mundo técnico? Incluso Heidegger dice, todo funciona. Y eso le parece aterrador, que todo funcione demasiado. ¿Cuál es su diagnóstico hoy día?
Well, it's dangerous in the sense that we get arrogant and overconfident in our ability to master nature through our technology. But on the other hand, then you get something like Hurricane Katrina or global warming or bird flu or, you know, all sorts of things where nature, I think, fights back in a certain sense and reminds people that, in fact, man is not so sovereign in the natural world. And I think that we could have in the future, you know, much larger catastrophes that we are going to have a very difficult time dealing with. So I am not sure that we have really reached that level of mastery yet, but certainly it's an illusion, I think, that many people share.
Usted ha tenido esa capacidad rara en los intelectuales de tener visiones sobre lo que va a pasar en el mundo. Bueno, el concepto de fin de la historia, que es muy polémico, pero fue muy interesante porque nos hizo ver que por lo menos un periodo de la historia humana estaba terminando, no la historia en un sentido literal. fue interesante. Luego el término del fin del hombre, ver esta encrucijada de América. Desde el punto de vista del mundo, ¿cómo ve el mundo hoy día? El futuro del mundo. ¿Cuál es la visión que se le viene?
Well, it's very hard to characterize the world as a whole because, for example, over the last 30 or 40 years, while Asia has been moving from the third world to the first world, Africa has actually been moving backwards. And so you can have these very great differences. I believe that modernization, the whole process of modernization will continue, and that will be the dominant story. And in fact, right now, for the last several years, the two fastest growing countries in the world, virtually the two fastest growing countries, have also been the two largest, China and India. And that's a remarkable situation, that you have that many people being pulled out of poverty, being given an opportunity to integrate with the rest of the world, to have higher levels of health care and education and all of the things that people want in their lives. And so I think there's an optimistic side of this story that sometimes gets missed because you then look at the AIDS epidemic in Africa, or you look at conflict in Latin America and the existence of poverty and so forth. But overall, I do think that there is a more optimistic story to tell.
Usted nombró ahí China. Bueno, China es un país al que hay que estar atento en lo que viene, evidentemente. Supongo que estará de acuerdo en eso. En China tenemos, por un lado, un desarrollo económico trepidante, con todo el ritmo de un capitalismo vital, pero al mismo tiempo un sistema político totalitario y autoritario. Ahí pareciera romperse la regla que siempre se ha dicho que a mayor desarrollo económico, necesariamente el sistema político cambia, y pareciera que eso no va a ocurrir. ¿Cuál es su diagnóstico sobre eso? ¿Cómo se van a dar la relación entre esta contradicción entre lo político y lo económico en China? ¿Qué va a pasar con China?
The question, I guess, that everyone has is, as China becomes richer, its citizens are going to be better educated, they're going to start to own more property, and they are going to create a diverse civil society because of, that's what happens in a developed country. And the question is, will they be content to be ruled over by a party that has no political accountability? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that political accountability is an important element of good government. The Chinese pride themselves, the Confucian tradition is about good governance by a well-trained technocratic bureaucracy. But the question is, in the long run, can they keep that up without the people who the bureaucrats are ultimately supposed to serve not having any power to affect the people that rule them? And I guess my intuition is that it's hard to do that, especially as the society gets richer, for people not to demand political rights.
Hablemos un poco de Latinoamérica. Durante mucho tiempo nos vimos muchas veces como el patio trasero de Norteamérica, de Estados Unidos. Hoy día parece que Estados Unidos ya no le interesa Latinoamérica. Y muchos piensan, y usted mismo le leí en una entrevista, que afortunadamente no está interesado hoy día en Latinoamérica. ¿Cómo ve usted esa relación? Es decir, si uno piensa que tal vez Estados Unidos hubiese intervenido más, hoy día tendríamos a lo mejor un escenario político distinto al que tenemos.
Well, the reason I said it was fortunate that the United States wasn't paying attention was that I think that there's a tendency in Washington to see Latin America through a kind of strategic perspective that has led to all of the interventions and, in a way, the bad reputation that the United States enjoys in Latin America. And I don't think that that's the appropriate way to see this part of the world right now. So that, for example, if the United States had tried to treat Hugo Chavez the way we've treated Castro, I don't think that would have been a better situation. I think it would have increased Chavez's appeal and so forth. So I'm just happy that, in a way, we're in a kind of period of benign neglect. I do think, however, that it's too bad. There's another story about the development of very strong economic and democratic institutions that the United States, I think sincerely wanted to encourage, and we probably had not paid as much attention to that agenda as we could have.
Samuel Huntington, en un artículo sobre la influencia y potencia de los latinos en Estados Unidos, advertía el peligro de que Estados Unidos fuera perdiendo su identidad, su raíz anglosajona, protestante, con la ética del trabajo. Usted discutió con él. ¿Cómo ve usted esta tesis de Huntington del terror o del temor frente a la presencia de lo latino en un país cuya raíz es anglosajona, la presencia de lo latino católico en un país de raíces protestantes y anglosajonas? ¿Cuál es su visión de eso?
Well, Samuel Huntington was my teacher and continues to be a friend of mine, but I also really disagree with him. Part of it comes from my own personal experience. I lived in Los Angeles for 10 years, and I remember I used to go to work very early, and every morning at 6 a.m. there would be a group of Mexican day laborers that were looking for work as gardeners or busboys on the street corner, and they had been up for long before I was. And so if being an Anglo-Saxon Protestant means having a strong work ethic, it seems to me that the people who work hardest in the United States are in fact these Latin American immigrants. That's the reason they come to the United States, because they want opportunities for their families, just like every other generation of immigrants, my ancestors and those of others. So in that respect, it just seems to me that fear is greatly overblown. There are problems created by immigration, particularly for American blacks and people, without skills, because those are the people whose jobs are threatened the most by new immigrants. But I think overall it's been a positive thing for the United States.
Señor Fukuyama, partimos el programa con las palabras de un poeta, de un gran poeta norteamericano. Con él mismo quiero cerrar el programa. Quiero leerle un breve poema, más esperanzador de lo que podría ser Estados Unidos en el mundo, dicho por Whitman en el siglo XIX. Me gustaría ver cuál es su reacción a este poema. Y el poema se llama En un sueño soñé. En un sueño soñé con una ciudad invencible a los ataques de todo el resto del mundo. Soñé que se trataba de la nueva ciudad de los amigos. Nada era allí más grande que el carácter del amor robusto, el cual capitaneaba al resto. Podía percibirse a cada instante en las acciones de los hombres de aquella ciudad y en todas sus miradas y palabras. Walt Whitman. ¿Qué siente usted ante ese poema?
No, it's a very beautiful poem, and I think it expresses something important about the American self-conception, that our influence in the world is actually not our direct action on the world, but in a sense what we are. And I think that's a important lesson for Americans to think about it at the present time.
Yo le quiero agradecer muchísimo, señor Fukuyama, haber estado en esta conversación, en el programa Una Belleza Nueva, estar aquí en China, en Latinoamérica, y agradecerle su coraje, su capacidad de estimularnos intelectualmente con sus libros fascinantes. Muchas gracias por haber estado aquí.
Thank you very much.